Ancient Egypt is one of the most fascinating places in world history. Their obsession with the afterlife, grand pyramids, and golden treasures, as well as the multitude of evidence they left behind about their great works, have captivated people's imaginations for thousands of years. However, beneath the veneer of mysticism and grandeur, ancient Egyptian history wasn't always the most pleasant place to live. Their justice system was often unjust and cruel. Some of their medical practices were horrifying, and their devotion to gods often pushed unexpected limits. So here are a few of the most frightening things about ancient Egypt. Pharaohs were shockingly obese. Most depictions of pharaohs show them as slim and muscular individuals. However, this couldn't be further from the truth. Pharaohs ordered artists to make them look attractive, but the actual bodies found tell a different story. Most of Egypt's royalty were massively overweight. Egyptian leaders had terrible diets. Priests were instructed to prepare 3 banquets each day, all overflowing with wine, beef, and pastries. They indulged in high-fat foods all day long. Mummies with clogged arteries, distended bellies, and massive layers of fat have been discovered. Obesity was a reality for Egyptian pharaohs. They were so familiar with it that medical texts about the dangers of obesity date back to 1500 BC. Egyptians took laxatives 3 times a month. Egyptian kings were deeply concerned about undernourishment. Perhaps they were overweight, but that didn't mean they wanted to be. Slim, muscular bodies were the beauty standard for Egyptian men, so they did what they had to in order to stay healthy. Most Egyptians took laxatives for 3 days each month using a castor oil-based laxative, and then spent the rest of the day on the toilet. This was before modern plumbing, so they had to clean up the mess manually afterward. There wasn't a problem they couldn't solve with laxatives. The idea was seemingly to forcefully remove illness from their bodies and get through the mess as quickly as possible. Lice were so bad that people gave up on hair. Most people in ancient Egypt shaved their heads. We know this from images and written records of people from other countries, observing Egyptian fashion choices, and wondering why Egyptians thought baldness was a good look. Historians today are fairly certain they know why. The reason was lice. Egyptian rulers' tombs were infested with lice, which seemed to spill out of the remains. Ancient Egyptians had lice remedies, but they either didn't work or weren't worth the trouble. Most people got so tired of the nationwide infestation that both men and women shaved every hair from their bodies. Women typically wore wigs, hair pieces that could be discarded when infested, while others simply went completely bald from head to toe. Terrifying temperatures. The temperature inside the Great Pyramid of Giza remains a constant 20 degrees Celsius. This means intense air conditioning in a desert environment where temperatures can reach up to 45 degrees C. But that's not all. The temperature inside the Great Pyramid also matches the internal temperature of the Earth at 20 degrees C. Was this a coincidence? Or did ancient Egypt manage to gauge the Earth's internal temperature and somehow recreate an artificially controlled environment with the same temperature? They didn't ride camels. Camels were not regularly used in Egypt until the end of the dynastic period. Instead, Egyptians used donkeys as pack animals and boats as a very convenient means of transportation. The Nile River flowed through their fertile land, acting as a natural highway and plumbing system. The current assisted those who needed to row from south to north, while the wind eased travel in the opposite direction. The river was connected to settlements, quarries, and construction sites through a network of canals. Huge wooden barges transported grain and heavy stone blocks, while lightweight papyrus boats carried people for their daily activities. Above the river every day, the sun god Ra was believed to sail across the sky in his solar boat. Servants were sometimes sentenced to death. Some people have heard of the legend that servants of pharaohs and other important figures in ancient Egyptian history were often ritually killed and buried alongside the deceased to serve them in the afterlife. Many today would tell you this is mostly a myth about the Egyptians, but the truth is actually more disturbing. While the practice of killing and interring servants was gradually phased out in the final centuries of ancient Egypt, the sacrificing of servants was once a common part of their society. Yet, those who were sacrificed this way didn't necessarily see themselves as killed. Ancient Egyptians had a complex relationship with death and were obsessed with the continuation of life after death. In a way, they were more obsessed with death than life. Those servants sent to die and be buried with their masters were considered privileged because they were allowed to follow a powerful figure into the afterlife to serve them. However, it was still likely nerve-wracking to know that your fate was tied to the random death of the person you worked for. Capital punishment in ancient Egypt was rare but extremely brutal. Life in ancient Egypt could be quite harsh, and beatings were a common method of obtaining confessions as well as a common form of punishment. However, while many know that ancient Egypt could be strict in terms of punishing wrongdoers like much of the ancient world, they were also against the indiscriminate application of the death penalty. Although this option existed within the legal framework, it was very rarely used. In fact, there was even a 150-year period in the ancient Egyptian Empire where no official executions for state-sanctioned crimes occurred. However, when someone did something really serious, like murder or treason, the death penalty they received was often quite brutal. Burning alive was a chosen punishment for serious insults against the gods, but there were other forms of capital punishment used by the Egyptians that were equally painful and terrifying, such as decapitation, drowning, and even impalement on a stake. Legends about ancient Egyptian curses just won't go away. Countless legends and stories have been told about the concept of mummy curses, and the concept goes deeper than many believe. Even before the tomb of King Tutankhamun was opened, stories were already emerging about mummies taking revenge when their remains were disturbed. However, the most popular tale claims that 26 people were involved in the tomb's opening, and then they all began dying under mysterious circumstances. The leader of the expedition succumbed very quickly due to blood poisoning. Analyses of the tomb revealed mold spores, but nothing considered highly dangerous. Not potent enough to affect someone if you only spend a short time in the chamber. Certainly, some have theorized that perhaps a weird disease that manifested as blood poisoning was involved, but most scientists reject this hypothesis, emphasizing that it's all a coincidence and that only 6 out of the 26 involved had anything involving recent death. However, while there may be no logical evidence of curses, that doesn't mean ancient Egyptians didn't try. Many tombs have various symbols around them, cursing those who disturb the remains, in the hope that they will be attacked by vicious animals like lions or snakes, or even punished by the gods themselves. Egyptian birth control was revolting. Egyptians had their own methods of practicing birth control. For their time, these were astounding innovations, showing that ancient Egyptians had an interest in an incredible understanding of medicine. But that doesn't mean these methods weren't disgustingly repulsive. Women had a few options for birth control, including different contraceptive mixtures. Some of the most used ones involved honey. But the braver women mixed tree leaves and crocodile dung. The woman had to insert that mixture into herself, or she would face 9 months of pregnancy. Men didn't get off easy either. Their male contraceptives weren't much better. They had to rub onion juice on themselves to avoid having children. It's unclear how many people used these contraceptives. If you didn't respect the sun god, he'd destroy you. In ancient Egypt, violent crimes were pretty rare. But one of the most horrifying offenses you could commit was any form of insult or disrespect towards the sun god. If you offended or robbed a temple, committed any form of personal disrespect, or were found guilty of any other sun god-related crime, you were usually sentenced to be burned alive. This punishment was reserved only for the gravest offenses and was typically accompanied by a ritual in which the individual was sacrificed to the gods. Although ancient Egyptians rarely practiced actual human sacrifice, this is one of the few exceptions. Although being burned alive was initially painful, it was considered the most awful death of all by ancient Egyptians due to the ritual significance of the act. They firmly believed in preserving the physical body for the afterlife and thought that complete destruction of the body through burning would leave them with no chance in the afterlife. Though the gods could still intervene to help the individual, it was a terrifying punishment for a faithful member of ancient Egyptian society. Indeed, life in ancient Egypt wasn't quite as glamorous as often portrayed in movies or documentaries. There were quite a few horrifying aspects, and many of us likely wouldn't have endured living in such a society. This concludes our episode. If you enjoyed it, feel free to subscribe to the channel for more intriguing videos. I wish you a splendid day.